What is the best weapon mod in Remnant 2? These are slottable abilities that can go on your different weapons. Each provides a different buff to your gameplay, whether that be elemental damage, summons, explosions, all kinds of really fun stuff. Now, some mods are actually attached to weapons, and these would be your boss-based mods. You're forced to consider the power of the gun alongside the mod, while others are way more versatile. Melee weapons also do kind of have mods, and those will not be considered here. Melee mods really are more just the weapon itself rather than a separate entity. So all of this considered, let's rank every weapon mod in Remnant 2 from worst to best. Starting off with the worst mod in Remnant 2, we've got the Cube Room. This is attached to the corrupted cube gun. It activates a large red cube that when stood in reduces heat generation of weapons. The mod itself is attached to one of the most unusable items in the entire game, having such high heat generation it is pointless to even try and mess with it. While the mod is affected size-wise by the amplitude trait, there is never any time where heat generation is this big of an issue, and the microcompressor ring is 1,000,000 times better than this option. You're never really going to benefit from this mod, and it should be completely reconfigured as it's currently a pure utility item that benefits no existing builds. F tier. Soulbinder allows you to attach some sort of entity to a single enemy. For the next 15 seconds, any damage you deal to that target is also transferred to other enemies in the area. Honestly, it's a really cool idea that just does not work in the game. Soulbinder is only usable when it is broken and doing things it isn't meant to do, like one-shot the One True King. The entity transfers only 60% of damage rather than 100%, so you never actually defeat any of the targets with it and only just harm them. Ideally, it's going to be for boss fights to keep ads off of you without switching attention from the boss. However, this just isn't useful enough. Any of the explosion mods can deal full damage to all enemies in the same radius. I do think it's pretty viable in the hatchery boss fight since there's a lot of ads running around, but not really good there still. F tier. Rotted Arrow is an explosive root shot that can now deal weak spot on impact. You shoot out a small spike that lands for weak spot damage and then explodes to deal explosion damage. It's a complete and total mess. Supposedly, the weak spot buff added to it was to make it better, but they made it even worse than it was before. Now both the landing damage and the AoE deal literally zero damage whatsoever, and it's extremely difficult to build into either way. This is way worse than any other explosion mod in the game, and while easily spammable, you should probably stay away from it if at all possible. F tier. Defrag is a bullet infusion mod that adds malware to all of your shots. Enemies defeated with the malware drop a red orb. You can either shoot that orb to deal extra AoE damage on the ground or pick it up to get a plus 20% to all damage buff. Now, a damage buff always sounds nice, especially one that buffs all damage like this, benefiting a lot of stuff. But defrag itself only works on kills and is incredibly difficult to manage in boss fights, if not altogether impossible. The AoE damage is extremely low, making it only worth the effort if you have about 6 or 7 on the ground at a time, which is nearly impossible to do. And picking up the orb requires walking over a spot there are likely other enemies attacking you from. The malware does last 30 seconds, which is significant, but it's a worse version of every other bullet infusion mod that is also much harder to maintain. F tier. Prismatic Driver is an explosive mod that fires a superheated beam. You have extremely low mod cost here that is built up to 30 charges. All of the charges will be used up quickly, allowing you to use the Prophecy mutator and keep the beam coming back at a constant rate. Each explosion does hit for good damage based on your build, but the ease of use is complete trash. You need to laser the enemy for at least 5 charges before the explosion actually goes off, which means it often takes 8 total charges instead when enemies are actually moving around. And now you're focusing down a single enemy for subpar explosion damage. In order to fix this item, it should just explode for every tick of the charge rather than building up. While it is usable, it's definitely not fun by any means and very hard to manage when in combat. The Spirit Healer mutator can do some wonky healing with it, but it's so low that the infinite buffs are worthless. F tier. Soul Brand is locked onto the Rune Pistol. Upon activation, you get a brand on all enemies that lasts for 25 seconds. Killing a branded enemy drops an echo that heals you upon pickup. Healing such as this here is just not worth anything in this game. There are many far better sources of healing, especially now that lifesteal fully regens you in seconds. In order for this to actually be worth your time, even marginally, the echoes would need to track to you from even very far away, and the healing should be way higher. fire. Also, being attached to a pretty mediocre gun that's a worse version of the corrupted rune pistol provides no incentive to force the mod into use. 10% of max health from a single kill sounds nice, but in actual gameplay it means nothing. And another mod that does nothing at all against bosses, which ain't great. F tier. Windfall is attached to the corrupted deceit, and actually this one is extremely powerful, allowing you to throw out low mod cost swords that mark enemies for weak spot. Shots from your corrupted deceit will now only hit weak spot, which is the highest damage possible on most enemies. Extremely valuable for sure. However, it's just broken right now, and not in a good way. There are multiple times throughout the game where the mod will be hitting a boss and not mark them at all, making both the mod and your gun completely worthless. Against the One True King, it does nothing, and against Keula, it's like a 50-50. Not to mention that you must single target down every enemy for this to work, making it do nothing in any of the dungeons. When actually fixed, it will be very good, but I mean, it's been in the game for months at this point and doesn't even activate the perk you use it for. F tier. Astral Burst is essentially a shotgun mod. On use, it sends out 7 star fragments that bounce off walls. You can actually get very solid damage out of them, and they regen quickly enough with the Prophecy Mutator for close-up mod play. But man, I've got no idea what this is even supposed to be used for. Yeah, it's gonna bounce off walls for more damage and then never hit the enemy. You need to have them track, or else what's the point of a bouncing buff that never actually hits the target? Then it says you deal reduced weak spot damage, but this doesn't seem to be the case when actually testing the damage. Plus, it's also impossible to hit weak spots in the first place when you're bouncing them off walls. You end up staring at the floor most of the time when firing it off, and while definitely usable for a boss like Red Prince, it's horrible in dungeons, and a very unsatisfying sound on activation. D tier. Time Lapse is a time stop mod that completely freezes targets in place. You get 7 seconds of them being frozen, possibly more with status duration items. If you happen to deal any damage to that target, they do unfreeze, but they are applied with a slow status. This gives you a brief window to reload, heal, or step back if things get too crazy. You can freeze multiple enemies at once, and it does help. But the problem is, Stasis Beam is miles better. Song of Afir is going to make it pointless entirely, and it really isn't all that easy to regen for what it does. None of the slow mods work on bosses to freeze them in place, so you're only taking Time Lapse to stop elites from rushing you in dungeons. And Time Lapse is going to be the worst of these mods that help with that. Honestly, a second charge would be kind of nice, and enemy shot should stay frozen for that duration. Otherwise, any status effect places them in the slow, breaking the effect altogether. D tier. Root Lash is a tendril that you can shoot out and have attack for you. They deal extremely low damage, but do lifesteal some health back to the player. Each tendril is going to last about 20 seconds, and while the description does say a max of 2 can be had, you can have about an infinite number of these. I could get about 6 or 7 usually, so not sure why it even says that. And with that many summons, you'd think, oh great, that's going to be nice for summon builds. No. Like I said, they do not deal damage. Just because something counts as a summons doesn't mean you can give it no damage and expect to balance things out there. This is useful, as we don't have hardly any summonable mods in the game, but it's simply terrible even if you wanted to activate summon-based items. With a max summons mod and all damage build, each tendril can't even take out the lowest health enemy before it gets to you. What we really need is for both of these to be capped at 2 tendrils alone and then actually deal like 200 some damage. D tier. Night Guard is another summons-based item that brings out 2 ghost swords. When far away, they throw ranged rays out, and up close, they melee. This used to be really cool as it granted shield with a certain melee mutator equipped, and with enough damage, they inflicted curse, weakening the enemy. Well, for some reason the devs decided to take away both of these really cool perks and yet did not increase their damage to compensate, because like Root Lash, they deal absolutely 0 damage even on a build maxed out for them. You're likely going to be forced to run them on pure summon builds anyway, as there really are no other options to choose from, and they count as 2 summons, which is a nice buff. But bro, we went from summons soloing stuff in the first game to them being the weakest mods imaginable in this sequel. Needs a major buff. D tier. Voltaic Rongeur is a large electric orb that floats through the air. As enemies get within range of it, they're shocked and applied with overload. The orb is going to last about 20 seconds and can cover good distance before disappearing. I really can't tell you why this should ever be used. It just really doesn't benefit you that much in any situation. Yeah, hallways where the orb can't miss, it does a good job, but only a good job and not a great one. Honestly, it seemed pretty decent in the hatchery, but any AoE is nice there in general. With the Maelstrom mutator on Sparkfire, it's spammable for sure. Honestly, the main issue is you just can't rely on it. There's no telling where the orb is going to end up, or if it's even going to hit your target that well. Plus, you need to shoot the orb after activation to increase its damage, which really doesn't seem to even be that big of a difference. Voltaic Rongeur really isn't bad at all, but you take this with massive inconsistency or Firestorm, that definitely is going to hit. Also, a single Krell Axe Throw is way better in my opinion. D tier. Supernova is attached to the Aphelion boss weapon. It fires a compressed star that when shot with the gun, explodes, dealing massive fire damage. The range of this mod is very high, allowing you to rarely miss, and the fire damage is high enough to take out even bosses quickly. The main problem is this has a corrupted version, which is a direct upgrade you will almost always use over this. And the actual Aphelion gun itself must be fired to activate the mod correctly, which that gun's very lackluster. You do not get enough ammo to be constantly activating a mod that could easily miss. Again, the damage is good, but nothing about this weapon or mod make it feel good to use, and it requires very solid secondaries to support it. Feedback does seem to be the best mutator here, although Maelstrom could possibly work. D tier. Bloodshot is locked onto the Corrupted Merciless and is a mod meant to buff the actual gun damage instead of being damage itself. On activation, you will instantly reload the weapon every third weak spot hit. This sounds great until you realize you only have 3 shots per magazine. So miss any of the bullets and now your mod is completely worthless. There is more to it that does make the gun and the mod pair a little bit better together, like the gun bleeds enemies this way, which is nice for certain item proccing, but for a corrupted weapon, the mod is only usable on bosses, and even then only a few of them. Really, the mod should just grant infinite ammo and avoid reloading altogether, requiring no weak spot whatsoever. Can deal nice damage, but most players don't enjoy this style, and it's outperformed easily by lots of better ranged weapons. D tier. Fusion Cannon is the mod locked onto Corrupted Savior. How this one works is the gun shoots to charge up mod charges. You get a total of 5, and for every stack, the mod deals more damage. At any time after one single charge, you can fire all of the charges for a laser shot, dealing high damage and weak spot damage as well. There really is a ton of power packed into each hit, but that's where the fun stops. This exact weapon was in the first game, and the mod was way better. Not only did it regen faster, but the beam itself could hit targets with very little aiming. Now, this version is extremely precise and easy to miss. Also, they just butchered this gun after the patch, like completely. Now it has this reticle that doesn't match the weapon at all, fires far too slowly, and keeping full mod stacks is not easy enough to do. The high damage on it is pretty awesome when it connects, but killing a hardcore reward like this makes it mostly pointless except for the cool factor, I guess. D tier. Skewer 2.0 is a multi-charge mod that fires out traps. Once connected with an enemy or an enemy walks over the trap, tons of wooden spears explode, dealing damage. Now this is very spammable with the Prophecy mutator, and it can be decent in boss fights and dungeons. But only decent, as it never impresses past that. Plus, for the longest time, I didn't even realize the significance of the name. Skewer in the first game was a mod that was tied to the Devastator, a fan favorite gun that sent massive bleeding spikes into your foes, easily one of my favorite weapons in that game, to then be memorialized as a mod spam item that is okay at best. I mean, building into crit or pure mod damage seemed virtually the same, and other than being able to set up like a trap, it's not unique at all. D tier. Shatterstar is the mod tied to Savior. Activating it imbues your shots with hot fire and reloads the weapon. Your shots now splinter out and burn other targets for 30% of the damage, and burns your main target as well. It's definitely nice to have more damage for the fun like this, but it's not really adding much to the actual gun itself. You can build into it with Ritualist to buff status damage, but why when there are 7 or 8 way better sources of status? You can use it with your ranged build to clear out groups while focusing on the main boss, but it only deals 30% to other enemies, so it's only good when the ads have no health. Savior is crazy strong right now, but Savior is strong due to the gun, and definitely not the mod. Plus, running a mutator to help this mod is kinda bad, as Supercharger is required to even play Savior at all. Good to have on this gun for sure, but not really what you want to have on this gun, which sadly, you can't take it off to fix that. D tier. Concussive Shot is a sound blast that shoots forward from your gun. It deals insane impact and has 2 charges to keep groups off you. Run it with the failsafe mutator and Redavant amulet to have a lot of fun blasting stuff over and over. The only large downside is you need to be relatively close to your target for this to hit. The crit on this mod is solid, it's extremely fun to spam, and a low mod charge lets you constantly use it. But Trimmer is a major upgrade over this option, and needing to hug your enemy isn't really ideal. Nice challenger mod for a melee brawler shoddy style of gameplay though. C tier. Ouroboros is the mod attached to Deceit. This allows you to summon 3 swords that spin around you. Charged melee send all the swords out to mark enemies for weak spots, which Deceit can exploit for high damage. Now, Deceit has been and always will be one of the highest DPS options in Remnant 2. Free weak spot is nuts and easy to break bosses with. But that really isn't due to the mod itself. It's more about how the gun works with the mod. Useless in dungeons, and terrible unless you have the correct setup. Also, being unable to use anything other than Supercharger for the mutator means the mod itself sucks. You need the mod there, but there's no way to build around it other than ranged damage. So very solid for sure, but versatility is kicked pretty hard here. C tier. Healing Shot is a healing orb you get 2 charges with. Throw them out to leave a green orb behind that you or allies can walk on top of to get a nice heal. This is not a full heal, so it isn't the perfect solution all the time, but certain builds have damage and no utility, especially builds that need to use relics in ways other than healing. Healing Shot can take that place, and the low mod requirement gives you the orb often enough. Healing really is easy to get in this game, from traits, rings, amulets, relics, and sometimes just shooting. So I rarely use this mod, but there isn't anything wrong with it whatsoever. And on certain new characters, this is as solid as you're going to get. C tier. Blood Draw is a single charge mod that attaches chains to up close enemies and pulls them out for high damage. The chains apply bleeding, which can stagger your opponents and work well with several different builds. For whatever reason, this does count as explosive damage working with the detonation trigger amulet, which means it works with Archon, Summoner, and Ritualist, and its regen is nice with very low mod requirement. It's essentially giving you a way to grab multiple up close enemies and stop them instantly. The Ravager and certain basic mobs can actually dodge out of it, which really should not be possible. But it's got some nice power behind each of the poles. Never my number 1 pick, but it creates a highly aggressive and up close mod build that isn't possible with anything else. Feedback or Prophecy I could see being great here as mutators. C tier. Starfall is the space rain mod attached to our bow Sagittarius. Since release, this has been one of the worst and most useless mods in the game. However, it recently got fixed to actually hit targets correctly. On an explosion build with detonation trigger, it actually deals solid damage to make it usable. Oddly enough, it completely breaks the astropath in orb form, which seems unintended, but hey, I'm gonna take it. The portal rains down explosions for 6 seconds, and that's the main problem. It isn't bad at covering an area, but once an enemy makes it through the portal, they're free without more damage taking them out. Also, since bows are pretty awful to use without Supercharger Mutator, you either run that or lose mod regen, or run feedback and lose all range capability on the weapon. You also can't really buff the mod duration, as percentage buffs on 6 seconds do almost nothing. Way better than it actually was, and very fun now, but by no means one of the better mods. C tier. Fargazer summons a small red orb that hovers above your character. Aiming down your gun sights will cause the orb to gaze at an aimed at enemy and apply madness to them. This madness is a status that stacks up to 10 times to deal damage over time. Lasting 30 seconds, it is never bad to add damage that goes through armor and is unaffected by weak spot hiding mechanics. It deals mod and status damage working with 2 of the strongest classes in the game. Overall, it does feel like a great mod to pair with certain builds where you know you're going to be shooting constantly. It does count as a summon, which makes it pretty nice on those builds, as most often you're going to use Archon anyway. My one complaint is that the madness stacks go away really fast, and regenning the mod takes a lot of effort. Several mutators work, but nothing really stands out for it. Fargazer has a lot going for it, but maintaining such a damage mod is more difficult than other options can be. C tier. Explosive Shot is the mod found on Hellfire. It was changed recently to give it a massive damage boost. Now, instead of being a simple explosion, it will explode dealing pure fire damage, meaning an Archon status build could be very strong with it. The damage is actually amazing, and with Maelstrom you can use the elemental damage to regen mods instantly. Sadly, the same problem this item had before is still its main issue. You're using a large explosion mod on an up-close SMG. The synergy here makes no sense. In order to regen the mod, you need to move in and hit with fire. In order to use the mod, you need to back up and let the explosions fly. That doesn't really make for a very fun gameplay. Yes, you can turn this into mod spam where you're really not firing the SMG at all, but something is just off about it. Hellfire should just be what it was in the first game, really, as having explosions could be replaced by a harder hitting flamethrower, I guess. C tier. Creeping Mist shoots out a mist that applies a certain effect to enemies inside. This causes all enemies to take 25% more status damage and receive 5% more crit chance from any source. This is a huge buff to all status builds as it's easy to throw out for a large damage boost. You can also throw it onto any of your builds just to get a small 5% crit chance boost, which can be more helpful than you might think. The big downside is the visual component. You lose a lot of vision when spamming this out. And often, I like having another mod dealing status damage instead. Great option, however, as the mod buffs solo builds and really buffs co-op builds as well. But it's not needed really, with some more fun options to look into elsewhere. Also, no mutator really adds much, so buffing your gun could be better if at all possible. I imagine fetid wounds or searing wounds are good. C tier. Spore Shot is locked to the gun Spore Bloom, and this one has been completely redone. It used to explode, dealing some damage over time and slowing the enemy. Now it deals no damage at all and does not explode. This lets you use it up close without hurting yourself. Plus, while inside the spores, you gain haste, which is a huge boost overall for gameplay. The point of this gun is to deal really high ranged damage, so giving it a utility mod that controls enemies better is a great idea. And standing in the spores for a buff is unique compared to most other things mods can do. My only complaint is why even give the spores damage at all? On a maxed out mod build, they deal 22 damage per second, which is just simply nothing even on basic enemies. Either take away damage altogether or greatly boost that so it's usable in mod builds. I don't even think it needs to be for mod builds as the utility is everything, but it's just weird as it is. B tier. Screamer is the mod attached to Meridian. Getting a total of 5 charges, you have a lot of mods to be used that can regen and be spammed with another weapon. The mod shoots out high explosive rockets that have very high crit damage and damage in general. You can make a very strong mod build with Screamer that can affect a wide area. The biggest issues are this gun's main fire mode is absolutely terrible, with a reload that really hurts when the mod is empty. And the corrupted Meridian version is easily in the top 10 best mods in the game. So Screamer is just a worse version of a better model. While there is no real reason to use this mod, it is still very strong if you don't have the corrupted version. Rita Vaughn Amulet with the failsafe mutator can give a lot of free mod charges, and heck, a rocket is never not fun, I will admit. B tier. Cube Shield is tied to the Cube Gun. This is a duration-based mod that summons a purple shield around you. It is only active while the Cube Gun is in hand, but the thing also blocks all projectiles. You can send this out to deal damage as well. I mean, that part's pretty bad, dealing very low damage overall, but as a helpful secondary gun mod, this is amazing. You can completely negate a lot of very annoying mechanics in different boss fights. Floating orbs shooting at you in the labyrinth, Nightweaver throwing orbs at you, Bruin spearing you, Annihilation orbing you, the entire Shahala fight. Cube Shield is definitely terrible for a damage-based mod, but when used like a support shield, it can completely change multiple parts of this game. Specifically, a lot of the areas and bosses on Narud are 10 times easier to take on. Just do be sure to run Ingenuity as the mutator, or firing the Cube Gun at all will instantly overheat, messing up your gameplay. B tier. Next up, we have the Polygun mod. This is a unique mod that has no real name and doesn't actually do anything. On activation, it switches the gun from ranged precision sniper to a shotgun. So essentially, you have a mod that grants you 2 different guns instead of dealing damage or adding support. Aside from the weapon itself being a totally unbalanced minigame that isn't fun for anyone to use, the mod is a cool idea. You can modify your gameplay to better fit which area you're in. This can be quite powerful if you learn which mode is more suited to certain skills, classes, and items. Overall, I don't really know what I was supposed to do with this one. The item itself is an anomaly most people don't really care about, and it's not really even a mod per se. I do think this is the best part of the Polygun though, that can be more useful than a lot of other mods. B tier. Stasis Beam has almost no mod requirement and gets 30 charges. With Prophecy as the mutator, it regens very quickly and can be used freely. The thing allows you to freeze enemies in place for 10 seconds. What's cool is that upping status duration increases this timer. With the Timekeeper's Jewel and Ritualist trait, you can freeze an enemy for 40 total seconds, which is just bonkers. Now, this is pretty useless for a large portion of the game. I mean, bosses are largely unaffected, and most mobs aren't really that hard to deal with. However, it can very much trivialize both Root Earth and the Hatchery boss fight. For the Primogenitor, you actually freeze the boss for 40 seconds, allowing you to deal any damage you want to him. It is the best way to take on that boss by far. And then we all know how some of those Root Earth enemies can be really annoying sometimes. Well, 40 seconds of them doing nothing can make the place a cakewalk. Mostly useless throughout the entire game, but in the right situations, it's a game changer for sure. B tier. Bore is a small drill that attaches to enemies and creates a purple pustule. The pustule then acts as a weak spot for the enemy, letting you deal way more damage to them there. This item was changed recently to now only have 1 mod charge instead of 2 and lasts 10 seconds instead of only 6. It was pretty much confirmed that the item is going to be modified in the future as well, so not sure why they bothered with this at the moment, but I guess it makes things more balanced. You can shoot the mod, yeah, but it's pretty hard to aim at correctly depending on the situation. Instead, you most often use this with melee because otherwise most melee options can't hit weak spots. Still a good melee option, but I mean melee in general took such a dive in this DLC, I see no reason to make a build around Bore, as tanking is now the way to go instead. But it is possible, and when correctly used, free weak spot damage is never bad to have. B tier. Witchfire is a line of flame that goes out in front of you. There are 2 charges and it deals significant fire damage to enemies inside the flames while also applying burning to them. When compared to Firestorm, there is never a reason to run Witchfire. But the mod by itself is still very good. You can cover large sections of the map cutting off enemies with amazing damage. It regens quickly with Maelstrom on the Sparkfire shotgun and works with Archon Ritualist builds to great success. I do recommend using the kinship trait as it is often very hard not to get burned by this wall of flame. But for some of those longer dungeons, it often clears stuff out with a decently cool aesthetic. B tier. Heatwave is an aura around the player that sets enemies on fire. It can have its range increase with amplitude and will deal very large amounts of fire damage on a ritualist build. Lasting 30 seconds, you can walk around a map instantly deleting a lot of your enemies without actually fighting them. Using the Energized Net Coil and Death Wish from Ritualist and even Elites are dropped in about 2 seconds. My issue with this is that I hate waiting around 3 total seconds for the fire to actually start burning the enemies. Even 2 seconds instead of the 3 that it is now would be way better, but even then it's still worth running on certain status builds. In fact, it's one of the very few items you can use while completing other actions, so it could be decent for certain melee builds where you're actively dealing damage with a mod that you're not actually using currently. Fun overall, which is saying a lot, and the range really does make Heatwave a valuable option. B tier. Guardian's Call is tied to the Twisted Arbalist weapon. In order to use this, you have to first mark a target by shooting them with the disc. Then you can send down a massive sword onto each marked target, dealing ridiculous stagger and damage. When built into mod damage, this can be very strong for dungeons as it clears multiple enemies at once. Apparently, you can manage to bounce this off your own summons if they're near a boss to have the AoE of the multiple sword stacks hit the boss for a lot of high damage at once. I tried the mod without this strategy and it does not do well on bosses. Also being forced to mark targets each time you want to use the mod, which always requires reload after every shot, it's kind of taxing in my opinion. Just a bit unnecessary fumbling around of the buttons, with the corrupted version being far better and easier to use. Great mod for crowd control and easy to regen with the bouncing bullets you have though. B tier. Energy Wall is a utility mod that creates an energy wall in front of you. Before the last patch, this was so small bosses could actually shoot you over or around it. Now they made the thing massive, and the weird aspect of Energy Wall is that it's useless for about 80% of the game. I mean, it does nothing in dungeons, and over half the bosses don't have projectiles that are going to be affected by this. But for the other 20%, you're going to nullify that boss's ability to deal any damage to you at all. With Nerud, all of the later bosses like to projectile you with lasers. One laser wall and you can now sit right in front of them dealing as much damage as you like. No actual build uses this as it isn't like a build-based mod until you get to that one boss where you need to switch up to use it because it prevents all your deaths and can protect your team as well. B tier. Eulogy is the mod attached to Sorrow. This one is very specific and odd to use to the point where it's either worthless or extremely powerful. Basically, you throw on detonation trigger for your amulet, use Archon and Summoner classes, and attach Bullet Weaver, shoot out about 5 bullets, and then hit the mod. This will pull those bolts back into your magazine. Now you can shoot 10 bullets quickly and hit the mod again. For some reason it scales with the explosions, letting you loop this nice playstyle over and over for very high damage. And all those bolts coming back actually heal you, so when you get into it, you can fully heal almost instantly every few seconds. The gun and mod are both worthless without this setup, but the build works so well I had trouble not running it for a while. Particularly, I like this for Venom as it bypasses his armor mechanic, and it worked really well against the Gladiator boss as well. Try it at least once, as there is nothing quite like this playstyle here. B tier. Hot Shot imbues your bullets with fire. This adds burning to all of your shots and increases range damage by 15%. It's objectively worse than all the other imbue mods except Defrag, because Acid adds crit, Shock adds speed, and Bleeds adds lifesteal. So fire adding plain range damage is the worst option while still being very good when it works for your build. Also being the best starting mod in the game, it's probably something you're going to use at some point. There are also many other more powerful sources of fire than Hot Shot right here, which makes it less used for sure, but definitely not something you should avoid altogether. B tier. Micronova is attached to the corrupted Aphelion. This is far better than the base version, sending out 5 total orbs instead of 1. Once all the orbs are sent out, you shoot one to explode them all for crazy damage. Now everything about this gun is improved from the other version. Shooting the orbs, damage, amount of fire in general, and how large of an area it actually affects. You almost never miss this attack, and with feedback as the mutator, it will completely regen itself most of the time. In fact, this mod can create its own mod spam with no other weapon at all. Kinship is a must, and some other explosions can be better, but a really good weapon that more than steamrolls Bloat King and Astropath into oblivion. Also, it staggers enough to rely on that, which is something you don't see often. B tier. And here we have Nanophase, which is tied to the corrupted Nebula. Now this is a weird one because it's simultaneously the most powerful mod in the game while also being one of the harder ones to use. Shooting with the regular gunfire will create nanobots. Now this is only going to happen if you hit weak spots, so that rules out a lot of bosses and boss phases where the mod is worthless. But when it works, you can use the gun to create nanos that then explode once the mod is activated. Since you can get many different nanos at the same time, the explosion gets really crazy high to the point where bosses lose chunks of their health bar. I mean, it's more than busted on several bosses. On the other hand, it's terrible in dungeons, has almost no ammo that you can run out of instantly, and is far less versatile than the base Nebula's mod. So it is actually much lower on the list than its power shows, because you won't really want to use it all that often. B tier. Banish is tied to the repulsor weapon, and it provides support to that item's damage. You get one charge now that completely freezes a target in place for about 5 seconds. Once they're unfrozen or returned from another dimension, they take 1.5 times damage from the repulsor. Now this did used to have multiple mod charges, while it only has one now. I think the gun is good, and the mod is there to provide both utility and actually buff your damage for the bosses. So it's solid all around, and for range builds, one of the better options in the game now, especially for more shotgun-oriented builds. A tier. Space Crabs is a mod that lets you summon a bunch of small space crabs. You get 2 charges, and each releases 5 total space crabs that then go and attack enemies. Pair it with a detonation trigger for explosion builds, or use it for your summon builds. They do have low mod requirement, meaning that Prophecy is really nice here, and it's just an easy way to get things going in fights. You've got a lot of stuff out there staggering enemies, blowing them up, possibly healing you depending on the build. Personally, I never run them, as there are better summon options to stay alive longer, and there are better explosion mods, but I can't disagree with the fact that they are cheap and easy to use. Also, they are able to hit flying enemies decently well when they do these small hops. For builds you would want to use them on, they offer something unique, and well, it's fun to say I have space crabs and go shoot down robots with them. A tier. Beta Ray is attached to the gun Alpha Omega, and what it does is latch on these data rays that stick to enemies. Once you swap weapons or reload, the rays are going to explode to deal very solid damage. These regen quickly, have low requirement, and can be latched onto at a time for extra damage. Honestly, there really is only one build to use here where you're going to swap this and the mod Helix over and over for absurd explosion crit damage. It doesn't have many other uses, but that specific build is really well rounded. Deals with every boss in the game easily and does not deal any damage to teammates, which is rare for explosions. Too bad it's tied to a pretty darn terrible gun, but avoid firing and you have a trap-based stacking explosion you can be very creative with in combat. A tier. Bloodline is locked onto the Merciless gun. It gets 3 total charges and fires a penetrating slug that has extremely high crit chance, and double stagger bonus. Plus, penetrating enemies increases damage to the next enemy hit. It did get hit with some nasty nerfs, making the mod take longer to regen and slower to fire, it seems. Even still, it has the power to cut down enemies quick. The advantage is it can hit weak spots. So you already get high crit, but now the additional bonus of red numbers. And with Maelstrom on the gun, you can get the mod back from Merciless's innate bleed status. Definitely worse than it was a month ago, but still a mod swapping powerhouse that works great against a lot of bosses. A tier. Gravity Core is the mod attached to Star Killer. Once activated, it sends out a black hole that sucks in enemies. After a few seconds, it detonates, dealing mega damage. This was extremely mediocre at best up until recently, and now it just does top-notch damage. I don't even know exactly what they changed, but the suck holds enemies in far better than it did before, and the damage always feels worth it now. In some cases, the crit damage is over 10,000 easily. I never found the right mutator, although some people like the failsafe mutator with the Reed Avant combo. Harmonizer with an explosive mod on your other gun feels better to me, but it's really up to you. Great for taking out groups with calculated defense and trashing bosses with high explosive damage. Just be sure to not get too close or you will be hit with your massive damage that one-shots without kinship. A tier. Ring of Spears is a major outlier on this list that you do need to be aware of. On its own, this is very much a D tier mod that's annoying to listen to and not really all that good to use in general. It pops out 7 spears that hit enemies around you. Amplitude actually increases the attack distance, which is really solid actually. Using the mod again is going to slowly send out 1 spear towards the enemy at a time, dealing weak spot damage. This has never resonated with me and always felt like too much effort for how little it actually puts out in terms of damage. Currently, however, this is one of the most broken things in the game. I can't confirm that this is bugged or not, but it is definitely trivializing the game, so I imagine it probably is. Basically, the spears are activating melee damage right now, so if you have the shielded strike mutator on your melee weapon, the spears grant shield on hits. Add in lifesteal traits and the relic and you cannot die. Because the spears attack so fast, they lifesteal and grant you infinite shield, which shield is already very strong defensively. Walk around the game never firing a gun and being immortal. It makes this item really strong right now and well worth using, although it's only going to work up close, and if it isn't patched in the future, I will be shocked. A tier. Overflow imbues your bullets with shock. This means you have 15% faster fire rate and reload speed while applying overloaded to the enemy. It's definitely not the best bullet imbue mod, but it is a very good one, because the faster you shoot and reload, the higher your DPS is, which means taking more advantage of your skills, class buffs, and trinkets when they're active. Very solid on all automatic weapons, although not the go-to option on any of the others. By far the best thing to try on this is the Bolt Driver sidearm with Supercharger or Sequence Shot as the mutator. There's no better way to use the mod, and the bullets fly. A tier. Guardian's Fury is the mod tied to the Corrupted Arbalist. Now, I haven't really seen much praise for this, and actually seen people say it's not that good. My experience, on the other hand, has been the exact opposite. No, it isn't the best explosive mod in the game, but it is still amazing and provides some advantages no other mod has. So what it does is activate a duration where all of your bullets on the gun are now explosive. This lets you bounce explosive discs off of walls or between enemies. Placing the Bandit mutator on it lets it get almost twice the amount of ammo before reloading even once, which means you activate the mod and lob out tons of explosive discs without almost ever reloading. Chakra as the trait is amazing to increase duration, and Amplitude lets the discs destroy everything. It isn't the top boss breaker, but still does good damage and is amazing for dungeons. The explosions bounce in between all your foes, taking them out instantly. This also lets you build into mod damage instead of regen, since it's a duration based mod. Feedback on the mutator worked pretty well for me, but you could also run Harmonizer easily, and do grab the kinship trait because you're gonna need it. A tier. Grab Shot is another mod that has been borderline F tier and useless up until just now. Recently, it was changed to not only apply slow, but deal pure bleed damage. This is a double charge mod that lobs out a bunch of caltrops all over the ground. Enemies that walk over these are slowed and applied with bleed. In the correct build, that bleed will instantly kill small enemies and deal large numbers to even bosses. For dungeons, it makes this a joke, as everything is not only bleeding to death, but slowed infinitely around you. Run the Maelstrom mutator on Sparkfire and you can cover everything in slow. It's actually super unique and fun to mess with. In boss fights, slow is practically worthless, but the bleed still lets it add something to the table. One of the best improvements from the last patch for sure. A tier. Death Brand is the mod on the Corrupted Rune Pistol. This, when activated, places a brand on all enemies, making them take 10% more damage, which is a huge buff as this affects all damage you can deal and is one of the only few mods to buff damage in general. Now, the mod also makes it so defeated enemies drop an echo, which increases weak spot damage. Actually pretty solid, as the Corrupted Rune Pistol deals amazing damage this way, but mainly you're gonna pop the mod to boost the damage. I think just playing into damage can hurt you sometimes, as utility and support are helpful as well, so it isn't quite S tier, but just damage increase in general when marking targets will never be a bad option. Basically, this is defrag if defrag wasn't absolutely terrible. A tier. Flying Bomb Trap is easily one of my favorite mods from the second DLC. This throws down several traps that lay on the ground. When enemies walk over them, pots filled with corrosive explosives are sent up into the air, and they're sent way up into the air, hitting all of the flying bosses as well. This mod works with several builds being explosive and status. Personally, I've used it with both an explosion build and a maxed out acid build, and both of them were quite amazing. The thing is, you cannot spam this mod. Only one of them can be out at a time. So even if you regen the mod fast enough to get out 2, it evaporates the previous one and replaces it. And I mean, it's stationary, so not as busted as Sandstorm, but enemies kited into this will be demolished, and I think it's one of the most fun items to make use of in the game at the moment. Feedback seems to work pretty well for me as the mutator, but you could also run Maelstrom and if you're running, say, Sparkfire. A tier. Moonlight Barrage is tied to the Crescent Moon bow. Always has been the best bow and still is because of this mod alone. Once activated, your arrows will apply moonlight to enemies. Hitting enemies who are then lit regens ammo, heals you, grants faster fire rate, and automatically charges all your shots. If you do manage to perfect shot the arrow, it fires 2 instead of 1, which actually lets you deal double the damage, and with faster fire rate, all you need to do is tap the button for this to fire both. It's a very easy way to deal some of the highest damage, and the mod regens fast enough to not really build into it, yet still come back quick. S tier. Chaos Driver is the mod on Enigma. This gets a total of 7 total mod charges, each firing a small electric driver. Drivers all connect an electric line to each other, able to deal large elemental damage and weak spot damage as well. It is very strong for mod spam builds with all the charges and can easily control fights. My one complaint is that they did nerf the mod firing speed recently, like big time, but instead of throwing on mod casting items to increase them back to normal, regular gun fire rate increases the driver lobbing speed. This makes no sense whatsoever and does not benefit how you actually use the mod or gun. Regardless, it can be used with so many different builds, and with failsafe or feedback, you get so much out of it. S tier. Deadwood is the mod attached to Thorn, a brand new DLC gun that fires explosive bullets. The mod works as a duration mod that lasts 20 seconds. During this time, all of your shots are not going to detonate, but instead stay attached to that enemy. Once you press the mod button again, all the needles explode at the same time, stacking your damage up to like, say, 40,000 crit. The mod itself is not as strong as other options because you deal no damage for so long, but the ability to instantly pop double 10,000s of damage is really strong. I recommend Bandit or Extender as the mutator for the best results. S tier. Will-o'-the-Wisp is the mod attached to Corrupted Sorrow. This actually works in the exact opposite way as regular Sorrow. You shoot out 10 bolts into the enemy, then activate the mod to send out wisps towards the bolts to deal crazy high damage. What's nutty is this also counts as weak spot damage, so get the crit up high enough and you deal some of the highest possible mod damage in the game that can also be looped quickly. This is a very similar style of damage to Corrupted Nebula, except it works on all enemies and is very easy to use. Bolts can also be used to heal allies, although this is largely pointless as it is not enough health to matter, and who's sitting there shooting all of their ammo into their teammates in the first place. Beef up your mod and crit damage and this is going to crush bosses for you. S tier. Heat Sink is the mod attached to Plasma Cutter. What it does is disperse all active heat generation on the weapon and decrease the heat generated while active for 50%. It basically means you don't have any overheating on the weapon for this duration. Plus, you can now ramp up damage times 3. Honestly, this allows Plasma Cutter to be the best gun in the game right now if weak spots are available. Heat Sink alone lets the weapon ramp up past almost any other gun's damage cap while lasering forever. I only rank it lower because the mod itself actually isn't that OP. It's the gun and mod combo which is definitely S tier, but not like, wow, look at the best mod in the game kind of thing. And really no versatility, as you can only run it with Hunter Gunslinger, but still, power is power. S tier. Familiar is by default one of the best mods in Remnant 2, as it is the only summon mod worth anything. Familiar summons a small crow that does activate summon trinkets for extra defense and lifesteal. Soul Link in particular is insane with this item. Familiar has your crow fly to the nearest enemy and start barraging them at inhuman speeds. I guess clawing and pecking rapidly. This grants it very high damage and a lot of lifesteal back for you. Run feedback on the mutator with the new leaking gemstone ring and burden of the follower. You're never going to need to shoot or do anything but keep the summon active as it regens before the timer is up. The only bad thing about this mod is that it embarrasses every other summon mod. It alone proves that there's a massive imbalance on these items and that we need more options for this as well. Don't recommend using unless you are doing a summon build with all damage buffs for that, but really darn good on the build itself. S tier. Helix is a salvo of small missiles that's sent out with precision. You get 2 medium cost charges that send out 6 tiny rockets. They go only where you aim them until impact, where they splinter out and track towards anything in the area. This lets you build into explosion damage and crit damage nicely, while also dealing damage to all enemies near you. Plus, Helix does not explode your own team or self, so it's one of the few options that can reliably be used for mod spam and co-op. You really want feedback or harmonizer on this with crit rings and the detonation trigger. Using it alongside any other high crit explosive in the game, and it's pretty much a free win. Not quite as strong as some other explosive options, as it doesn't really clear an entire area in a second, but there really is so much reliability here that it's always a go-to on my corrupted Meridian builds. S tier. Tremor is a large wave of energy or a shockwave. With 2 charges, you can send them out to deal damage in a very wide area. Amplitude makes this hit everything in any of the dungeons, and using detonation trigger does add fire to the wave as well. The advantage here is control, as this deals extremely high impact to almost any target close enough to matter. So with say feedback, prophecy, or harmonizer, you throw them out constantly and keep things from even moving while also dealing solid damage. Now the damage does not top other options by any means, but it will defeat even bosses by itself, and there's no skill required at all. Drop it on down, wait till the wave is gone, drop another, repeat as everything is dealt with for you. You can use this on other builds just for support, although the mod requirement isn't all that low. Much better on those Archon builds where you can get as many tremors as you want. Since release, this really has been one of the best mods to clear the game with, and yeah, it's gonna hit flying enemies as well if they're close enough to the ground. S tier. Abrasive rounds applies bleed to your gun's bullets. This also adds a 5% lifesteal to your shots on that weapon. There's an argument to be made here that just plain lifesteal and some bleed over time is not quite as strong as say overflow, but I disagree. The lifesteal added here is insanely good, and bleed for a large portion of the game can provide a massive advantage. Also, the look that your weapon's bullets actually get with the red dripping is way cooler than even corrosive rounds. This also allows you to use a setup where you use fetid wounds as the mutator and now have acid, high crit, and bleed with lifesteal in a single weapon. Krell Axe also has shock, so now you could easily apply all but fire, which guess what? The Spark Fire Shotgun has that on it, leaving your sidearm to have any mutator or mod in the game. This setup alone is worth a top ranking spot. S tier. Dreadwalker is the mod attached to the fan favorite Nightfall. This mod by itself is easily one of the best gun buffing mods in the game that gets massive upgrades from the second DLC. When active, this grants infinite ammo, much faster fire rate, 10% lifesteal, which is a lot, and the gun is fully automatic. The downside of Nightfall is that it fires like a scout rifle, which feels terrible. Well, you can actually wear the leaking gemstone and have some increased mod duration from the chakra trait, allowing you to regen the mod while it's active, granting infinite Dreadwalker, which means infinite lifesteal and infinite high damage. Run this with Bullet Weaver as the mutator always, and it is one of the most fun builds in the game currently. Actually buffing Nightfall up from an A tier as a gun and placing it all the way up in S as well. S tier. Chain of Command is the mod locked onto Monarch. Now I consider Monarch to be the best range gun in the game, possibly just behind Plasma Cutter depending on the situation. And that's entirely because of this mod right here. Chain of Command has no mod charge at all and instead lets you fire a harpoon that latches onto enemies or even just the wall. Your bullets now track exactly to that target, requiring no aim from the player. Most often, this auto tracks directly to the enemy's weak spot, and if not, you can angle it correctly for it to do so. Plus, while the harpoon is attached, your rounds build up a meter. When the meter gets filled, you pound the ground, gaining 20% more damage and infinite ammo reserves. It's definitely the easiest gun in the game to use that literally never misses. A true easy mode, and if you get it firing fast enough, the damage is incredible. The only possible gun buffing mod that even remotely competes with Nightfall, and it beats it. S tier. Big Bang is the mod attached to Starshot. You will always run this with Detonation Trigger and probably Harmonizer or Feedback as the mutator. What it does is have multiple charges. When activated, it uses all current charges to send a massive blast out, or a nuke. The more charges consumed, the more damage it deals. This is explosive and fire, so its damage is instantly top tier, and better than a lot of those other main weapon explosion mods. The best part is that Starshot's main mode of fire also counts as explosive, so this more quickly regens the mod, with Maelstrom letting you keep nuking everything you see. This mod can get pretty darn brain dead very quickly, as it one-shot hits every enemy on the screen and instantly drops them. Its range with the amplitude trait is just wild to see, and the thing is much stronger than most other sidearms, possibly even most main weapons we have available. S tier. Deadpoint is the mod attached to Corrupted Meridian. This mod here puts out the most crit explosion damage in the game, and it's not even close. In terms of burst damage, this thing shreds, and I found that with the Rita Vaunt Amulet and Failsafe Mutator, you can lob out about 5 or 6 cluster bombs in a row for a boss's entire health bar to melt even on Apocalypse. The thing gets 2 mod charges, both lobbing a cluster bomb. Once it lands, the cluster explodes into many different tiny explosions, granting it insanely high crit damage, and on a mod explosion build with Detonation Trigger, it obliterates. In my opinion, it's the best explosion mod in the game, aside from one other option that is almost tied with it. Definitely the best corrupted weapon in terms of ease of use and power, allowing you to bypass every mechanic of any boss in the game and shred them in seconds. S tier. Loathe of the Weak is the mod attached to Anguish, being the one and only mod that can possibly top Deadpoint or Corrupted Meridian, and this is because you gain infinite explosions that cost you nothing. What Loathe of the Weak does is activate a duration-based mod that fires needles out of your gun. Needles land and then explode after a little bit. The thing is, you gain infinite needles while the mod is active, and with faster fire rate, more needles get out for higher DPS. So, what you do is equip Bullet Weaver for the fire rate and mod regen, run Arcanus Prime, use Detonation Trigger with crit rings, and increase mod duration with the Chakra trait. Now just shoot out a Gatling gun of explosions that trivializes every encounter. Enemies don't get instantly blasted, but after several needles are attached, they're guaranteed to be gone seconds later. This is the only option that grants you the power of explosions in form of a gun, which just opens up more opportunity for higher DPS than anything else can match. The main fire rate on Anguish is still garbage, but thankfully you don't ever even need to use it. S tier. Nanoswarm is the mod attached to Nebula. Nanoswarm unleashes nanomachines that apply acid and deal corrosive damage for 15 seconds. It is easily one of the most versatile mods in the entire game that you can always throw on any build to greatly boost damage. Corrosion alone makes anything you do have 10% more damage. The nanobots can easily solo dungeons and infinitely regen with a nice status build. They've got high crit chance, letting you make use of interesting trinkets, and it is active damage you don't have to worry about yourself. Let the mod go and then start putting in work with whatever else you have. For actually making a legitimately good boss beating build, Nanoswarm is the best and most versatile option, being the same buff Corrupted Rune Pistol has with active damage, and also being fun because the mod was busted in the first game as well. S tier. Firestorm is the massive fire tornado that can be placed on any weapon. Yep, it's an S tier item, and if you don't know about it, I have no idea how, as almost every build video in the world has this in it. You get a massive fire tornado that no longer sucks in players, yet sucks in all enemies, even bosses. They did fix this breaking boss AI, however it can stack on itself, letting multiple fire tornadoes deal damage at the same time. You can also use the amplitude trait or the magnifying glass amulet to have it attack the entire screen at once. Build into fire damage, build into mod damage, build into crit damage, use the tornado to regen other mods with feedback or maelstrom, sit it on an enemy and watch them instantly die with no effort from you. The only reason it isn't number 1 is, well, there are a few other better options, but also it completely blinds you altogether. Once 2 or 3 of these are out there, you really cannot see what the boss is doing, and you might get hit because you literally don't know what's going on. Also, without kinship as a trait, you die as soon as you equip this. Has been one of the most OP mods since launch, and continues to be so good I stopped using it entirely just to actually have to play the game. S tier. Corrosive Rounds is the best bullet imbue mod. This might be the most used mod in the entire game. It's on every single range build possible, as the buff provided is much higher than anything else has. And it really is one of the very few options that helps range damage in the first place. The first thing it does is apply Corroded, which is already the best element as it deals damage over time and makes enemies take 10% more damage. Then it increases ranged crit chance by 15%. This is one of the biggest ranged crit chance buffs in the game, and that damage type is the strongest thing you can deal for range damage. So if you're not running this, you're pretty much actively nerfing your damage for no reason. Now, the Fetid Wounds mutator does make this not necessarily a must, depending on the build, but still almost always used. I mean, literally any build focusing on mainly range damage is heavily buffed by this item. It also makes your bullets sound amazing on hits and have a gross green color scaring your enemies. Top-notch item that should be the first on your bucket list for any new character. S tier. Sandstorm is the mod attached to the brand new Monolith weapon. It is easily the dumbest and most broken item ever placed in this game that I can guarantee you will get hit with heavy nerfs in the future. This is how you make a good build now, as it does everything in the game by itself. Launch out a Sandstorm that deals elemental damage. The storm itself lasts 15 seconds, so with feedback as the mutator, it regens itself before running out. Now add in the amplitude trait and it does all of the following. Provides the ability to activate more crit items at one time than anything else. Applies Exposed, making enemies take 15% more damage. Attack constantly across the entire room. Tracks enemies. Works with Archon and Ritualist. Regens other mods easily. Staggers enemies as it attacks. And literally plays the game for you. Sandstorm is the only possible damage-based mod that could compete with Firestorm. Because it is Firestorm. If it dealt more damage, debuffed enemies, didn't harm you, and dealt more damage. The only kind of downside you could say about it is that when using it, you can't see anything, as it covers all the enemies. But who needs to see when one mod clears the entire game for you? There seriously is no better damage almost in the entire game than this mod right here. It will definitely not be surviving more nerfs, so enjoy the completely broken gameplay while it lasts. S tier. And finally, we have Song of a Fear, which is and always has been the best mod in the game. Because you can do all the math on your builds that you want, but gameplay and versatility of items will win in the end every time. And the only item that can be used on any build with no downside whatsoever is the Song of a Fear. Also, being one of the very few items that takes out Annihilation's orbs in a single attack. This mod sends out a blast of sound that rings repeatedly for 15 seconds. The initial impact deals very high damage to anything in the air, taking out many adds in those boss fights. While the mod is active, all enemies inside the area are applied with slow and they deal 10% less damage. This mod will make sure no enemy gets to attack you throughout the entire game. It makes every tough encounter child's play and can be used regardless of what class you have equipped. Of course, it is easier to use with Archon, but even for range builds, this is never bad just to slow enemies down for better aimed shots. It also works with the detonation trigger to apply burning, although that is not very useful all things considered. Run it with feedback or bullet weaver depending on the weapon, and you can keep all enemies away from you. No, it's not a boss mod whatsoever, but it lets you focus on the boss instead of worrying about other enemies in the fight or random obstacles that could show up. Plus, sometimes it may just grant you enough defense to survive an attack here and there and get you out of there for the win. Anytime you're having trouble, Song of a Fear is a #1 solution regardless of the situation. S tier. And there you have every weapon mod ranked in Remnant 2. I personally tested all of these thoroughly and have many hours with each item. All the D tier items and above are usable, while the F tier stuff should just not exist in the game or needs completely reworked. Right now, it's hard to not just use Sandstorm and Firestorm as they are completely broken, but a lot of mods are extremely fun and can make amazing builds. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, and do let me know in the comments section which mod is your favorite right now. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.